Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Danger Boys podcast series. My name is Tappers, and today we're going to be doing a bit of a spooky episode on the Appalachian Trail. So, like I said, I wanted to do a bit of a spooky story. It's been a little while since we've talked about survival situations and situations of danger in nature specifically. And so, like I said, I wanted to come back to that. This is kind of like the, I don't know if you've watched the Franklin episode or the K2 episode. This is going to be along the same lines of that. But also as well, too, like I said, this is going to be a bit of a bit of a spooky story. At least I'm going to do my best. And also, too, true story. Because this is not a fiction story. This is a true story. And before we get into the meat of this episode, if you will, what we're going to do is we're first going to talk about the history of the Appalachian Trail a little bit because, of course, this is a history podcast. And you know what? I just can't help myself. So that's what we're going to start off with. We're going to talk about, like I said, the Appalachian Trail, the history of it, how it was founded. And then, like I said, we're going to dedicate the bulk of this episode, though, to a woman by the name of Margaret. And we're going to try to tell her story to the best of our ability. And so let's get started. So the first thing is we're going to take a look at the Appalachian Trail itself, right? The actual whole length of it as it stands today. And so if you look up in the top northeast, up in Maine, that's one end of the trail. And then down all the way in the south of Georgia, that's the other part of the trail. And so this is like I said, this is the whole length of it from top to bottom. And so we're going to talk about the guy who founded the trail, kind of how it got started. The man who founded the trail was a guy by the name of Benton McKay. Benton McKay was born in March of 1879, and his family moved around New England. He lived all over New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, and even New York City itself. But in the year 1888, Benton's older brother had bought a estate outside of Boston in a town called Shirley Center, and the family had called this place the Cottage. And so Benton, from a very young age, from the time he was 8, he loved roaming the countryside. He loved taking long walks in the woods, exploring, being in nature, being around nature. He absolutely loved nature. And so as he got a little older, he would spend a lot of time at the Smithsonian, where he would make sketches of the displays, and he would also attend lectures. Like I said, as he got older and he came into his teenage years, he would sit and listen to lectures by former Civil War veterans. They said by professors. He absolutely loved, like I said, visiting the Smithsonian, walking through nature, and paying attention to lectures. Well, Benton ended up graduating from Harvard in 1905. He was a part of at the time, a bit of an experimental program at Harvard. This experiment, by the way, was like geology and forestry. That was not previously studied at Harvard, but when Benton got there, they began to. And so Benton was kind of in the inaugural class of geology and, like I said, forestry. And so he graduated with a bachelor's degree in arts, and with his background of, like I said, being in the woods since he was a small child, and of course this geology class that he had attended at Harvard, he started working for the United States Forest Service. Okay, so fast forward a couple years in 1921, and Benton had written a paper that was eventually published in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects. And what he did was he proposed a trail that would span the entire 2,192 miles of the Appalachian Mountains, right? Like I said, from the tip of Maine all the way down to Georgia. So 16 years of hard work and organization from the United States National Park Service to local communities who strived to get this trail built, worked over the course, like I said, of those 16 years, building the trail itself, connecting different sections together, working together with other states in order to make sure that the trail connected in the right way. And so in 1937, the trail was officially declared complete. But it wasn't until Ed Schaefer from York, Pennsylvania in 1948, he was the first person to actually walk the entire trail. And he started in Maine and he walked down to Georgia. His claim is slightly disputed. People said that he took a car for some of the journey. And so whether or not Earl was actually the first person to walk the entire trail, he's the first person to claim to. And so, yeah. So like I said, that's a bit of the history of the trail itself. And we're going to look at it as it stands today, right? So like I said, officially, the trail starts at Mount Katahdin, I think is how you say that, in Maine, to Springer Mountain in Georgia. Like I said, the trail crosses over 14 states, and it's over 2,000 miles long. It's actually claimed by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy as the world's longest hiking-only trail. Over 3 million people visit the trail every year, walking various segments of it. There's a lot of trail parts that are more easily accessible than others, and so these easily accessible areas see a lot more foot traffic than some of the more remote areas. But of these 3 million people that visit the trail every year and walk along some segments, of about that 3 million, about 3,000 people are actually there to attempt to walk the entire trail. And of these 3,000 people every year that attempt to walk the whole trail, only about 25% of them actually succeed. And of course, although very rare along the trail, violent crimes have been known to happen. Like I said, we're going to be looking at one of those today, the very first violent crime to happen on the Appalachian Trail that was reported. So like I said, we're going to be talking about Margaret today. This is Margaret. This is a photo of her. At the start of this story, she had not yet turned 18. She was only 17 at the time. She just graduated school, and she had her entire world ahead of her. And so, like I said, this is Margaret's story. And I said this is a true story as well. This is not. There's no fiction, to my knowledge. I've researched as best as I could, and this is a true story. Margaret had not yet turned 18 in 1974 when she met a man by the name of Joel Polson. Joel loved the outdoors, and he loved sharing his stories and adventures with other people. He loved hanging out with his friends, going on adventures, walking through the woods. He was very outdoorsy. Margaret had worked at a diner, and Joel often came in with his hiking boots on and telling Margaret about the stories of the adventures that he had been going on. And so over the winter, right, like I said, he and Margaret kind of connect over this shared love of adventure. And so he told Margaret about, his next great one, which was he was going to hike the entire Appalachian Trail from Georgia up to Maine. He was going to do it this spring in 1974. At first, Margaret was a little taken aback. She wasn't very outdoorsy herself. She didn't do a lot of walking. But the more Joel talked about it, the more she was fascinated and the more she wanted to do it. And so eventually she agreed, and she thought it was going to be a great idea to accompany Joel on this hike. She wanted to learn more about herself. Like I said, she wasn't even 18 yet. She had just graduated school. And like I said, she wasn't outdoorsy. She wanted to be more outdoorsy. She wanted to, explore nature. And what better way to explore nature than by walking through it, And so, like I said, in early May 1974, Margaret and Joel set out to be two of the 43 people who would eventually walk the entire trail that year. So like I said, in 1974, over the course of the entire year, only 43 people can claim to have walked the entire thing. And so like I said, in 1974, this is still a very rare thing. It's not very many people are doing it. And so when they set out in the morning in May, Margaret is overwhelmed by the blooming flowers in the Georgia spring, the sun and the rays coming through the morning mist. Her breath was taken away by the beauty of the world around her. But she quickly realized that hiking is a lot more difficult than it originally might seem. Like I said, Margaret was not outdoorsy, and neither was Joel. Joel, as much as he loved going on adventures, going on a 2,000-mile hike is something that these two have underestimated. And so before even supper time, by the mid-afternoon, Margaret had already developed a blister on her heel. And so they stopped and rest for a moment so that way they could put a bandage on and she could continue walking. And so they're walking up a hill. The trail they're on is fairly uphill, fairly steep. And so once they get to the top of the hill, right, they realize that the trail goes back down the hill. And so they're both very relieved. Like I said, they're both very tired. And so they walk down the hill and they get to the bottom of the hill and there's a little sign that says Low Gap Shelter, 190 yards this way. Right, it's off the trail a little bit, back in the woods. So they had already walked 6 miles, and evening was very rapidly approaching. And so Joel and Margaret decide that this was as good a place as any to rest for the night. The shelter is a small lean-to that's next to a brook. I have a photo of the lean-to we'll take a look at here in a second. So they walk down the trail towards the lean-to, and they realized that a fellow hiker had already been resting inside. The hiker looked up as they approached. He introduced himself as Ralph. The world would later know him as Ralph Howard Fox. Margaret thought that Ralph was pretty unassuming. He was 5 inches shorter than Joel, not as stocky, and Margaret gave him very little mind. The only thing she really thought to herself was that he didn't really have a lot of gear. He had one small backpack and, a little sleeping bag, but not much else other than that. If he was going to be walking the entire trail, he was going to need a lot more supplies than that. And as though he was a little dirty. Margaret, thought to herself, man, this guy could probably use a shower. But again, you're out hiking, you're going to meet a lot of people like that. You're going to meet a lot of strangers and weirdos out in the woods sometimes, so she didn't really think much of it. So Joel and Margaret, right, they take off their backpacks, they start to settle into camp, begin to get themselves comfortable, explore the area a little bit. Like I said, here's the shelter, Low Gap Shelter. See, like I said, it's a little lean-to on top of these concrete pillars. It really hasn't changed much since the 70s, and so this is basically the same shelter it was when Margaret and Joel came across it. Over here to the right, I believe, is the brook. The small stream that runs past the shelter, it's over here to the side. And then I believe over here to like the bottom left of the picture is a fire pit. I think it's over here. Or maybe it's on the other side. But long story short, this is what the shelter looks like. Okay, so like I said, Margaret, she walked over to the stream to wash the sweat off her arms and her face. And that's whenever Joel approached her. Joel had noticed something. Joel, in a hushed tone, whispers to Margaret that he didn't trust Ralph. Ralph pointed out that the lack of his gear meant that clearly he was not out here hiking for very long. And his improper shoes. He didn't have hiking boots. He had normal, everyday shoes. And this is not a man that's been out hiking. And so Joel and Margaret, they realized very quickly that they had left their bags unattended right next to Ralph. And right now he could be rummaging through their stuff. And so they quickly returned to the shelter, but Ralph hadn't moved at all. He was exactly where he was whenever they left him. As evening began to grow even more, the sun went down further. Joel built a fire and he began to cook dinner. He even offered some to Ralph, but Ralph said no. Although he didn't say much, Ralph did make 3 trips into the woods to gather fuel for the fire. This eased Joel's mind over Ralph. If this man is going off and getting firewood for us, he clearly can't be that bad of a guy. He doesn't talk much, but that's okay. People are allowed to be private. But he didn't think he was a bad guy at all. And Margaret even decided to go to sleep early. The sun had not fully set yet. But like I said, Margaret began to lay down in her sleeping bag. As she was about to close in for the night, Joel came over and told her, hey, I'm going to wake you up early in the morning. We have a lot of ground to make up, And so we're going to get started really early. And with that, Margaret watched as the fire got bigger, as Ralph and Joel threw more logs on, and the two men stood around the fire watching it. Let's see. So, early morning the next day, Margaret has not yet woken up. Ralph lays in the shelter with his fellow travelers, and he's waiting for one of them to wake up. Joel was the first one. He rose out of his bed, stretched, moved around the camp, collecting his things and beginning to pack his bag. Joel went over to Margaret, and he urged her to wake up. He urged her to wake up. Margaret looked around. She realized that Joel had already packed his bags, and Margaret decides that she should probably do the same. Joel moved on to the brook. After waking Margaret up, he wants to get some fresh water on his face, wake himself up. And so Joel goes down to the creek. He puts his hands in. He scoops the water out. He stands up. He shakes his hands. He breathes in the fresh spring air in the early morning. As Joel turned around and began to walk back towards the fire pit, Ralph got up out of his sleeping bag and stepped out of the shelter. Margaret didn't think anything of this. She was just getting her boots together, and she was lacing them up, tying her boots. And as she's looking down at her boots, she hears a loud, sharp boom. Looking up very quickly, she sees that Joel is now hunched over, very unnaturally. His head is resting on the metal fire ring that protected the fire from escaping. His head is now on top of that, and the fire is still smoldering. With all of her breath gone, she could only watch as Ralph ran towards her with a revolver in his hand. "Roll over and be quiet." These were Ralph's first words to her, which were followed by, "Get up." "Is Joel dead?" she manages to ask as Ralph leads her deeper into the woods. Ralph lies. "No, he's just hurt." Margaret asks if he could move Joel so the still smoldering fire wouldn't hurt him, and Ralph agrees to. While tying her to a tree, Ralph asks if he needs to gag her. "No," she says. "And what are you going to do with me?" Margaret asks as a blindfold is placed over her eyes. "Don't know yet," is the reply she hears as his footsteps walk back towards camp. As the birds chirp and the leaves rustle, "Is this really happening?" is the only thought she can muster. Minutes pass until Ralph finally returns. He unties Margaret and he removes her blindfold. He leads her back to the shelter, but there's no sign of Joel. "Where is he?" Margaret manages to ask. "I got rid of him," Ralph replies. Ralph sits Margaret down in the shelter, ordering her to eat and drink as he rummages through Joel's pack. He demands from Margaret to know where Joel's money is hidden, and Margaret told him where to find cashier checks within Joel's bag. As Ralph is satisfied with his loot, Margaret says, "You don't have a reason to kill me. I didn't do anything to you." Ralph responds, "Well, neither did Joel," as he grabs her and leads her back into the woods, even deeper this time. Ralph hides Margaret's backpack under some leaves, and he ties Margaret to another tree, bounding her hands and her arms. He doesn't blindfold her this time. Ralph had grabbed Joel's helmet that Joel had been wearing, and he filled it up with water, and he set a granola bar next to Margaret in a place where she would be able to reach both. "Someone will come within an hour. Then again, it could be tomorrow." Ralph shrugs as he leaves Joel's watch within Margaret's view. With the sense of unreality still around her, Margaret watches the seconds tick by on Joel's watch, each one feeling like an hour, while her ears strain to hear Ralph's footsteps returning, spelling her doom. 15 cruel minutes pass by, when those most dreaded footsteps begin to get louder. Okay, God, here I come. Margaret prays, knowing that her time on this earth may be over. I can't leave you here. It might be days before anyone shows up. You'd die, and I don't want that. I didn't want to kill Joel. I just wanted his gear. I had to, though. He was a big guy, but I've never whacked a chick before. He told her she had two options. Either stay tied to the tree or walk with him to the nearest road where he would release her. Not wanting to spend another minute tied to the tree, Margaret agrees to hike out with Joel's murderer. As they moved away from the shelter towards the trail, instead of walking south to where Joel and her had just started the day before, Ralph ordered Margaret north, saying that if we run into anyone before we reach civilization, and you say anything or do anything to signal that there's something wrong, you'll all die, and I'll kill you first. You set the pace. If you need to rest, stop. Anything you need, will do. Margaret did not buy the nice guy routine from Ralph. She knew that her life was still very much in danger. But she did as she was told, and she walked down the trail, with the revolver pointed at her back. They reached a spot of the trail that overlooked a large precipice. At any moment, she knew Ralph would surely push her off the edge, or shoot her in the back and push her body over the edge. In order to stop herself from panicking, Margaret forces herself to talk. She says, "You seem like you're running from something." "I've been in and out of the pen. The FBI is probably already looking for me," Ralph says. As the pair leave the precarious edge, two men with chainsaws come into view walking down the trail towards them. Margaret began to panic. If anyone saw the gun or asked too many questions, Ralph surely would act. The men merely state that they have to keep moving as the ride was picking them up to the south in the afternoon. As the men began to walk away, Ralph asked about the next road crossing towards the north. The chainsaw men responded that it was a long way away, a decent hike as they put it. Margaret realized that she might have to spend the night with Ralph in the woods. Ralph, however, needed constant breaks, and it was clear that Joel's overpacked bag was weighing him down. Ralph began to talk about himself, about how he lived in the West, about how he missed the West. He was happier out there. And that's why he explained he had to rob Joel and he had to kill Joel because he needed money in order to go back to the West. And the only way to get that money was by killing Joel. They keep walking until they finally reach a place called Rocky Knob Shelter. Ralph decided to pull out the map that Joel had in his bag. And Ralph noticed that the next road crossing was only 3 miles away. Ralph told Margaret that he had changed his mind and he wouldn't be letting her go. He said he needed time to think. So what they should do is they should hitch a ride into town and they should get a motel room. They continued down the trail, eventually reaching Georgia Route 75, where a young woman pulled over and offered to give them a ride. After being dropped off at a restaurant, Margaret asked whether or not she could cash a $20 traveler's check that Joel had. And she also asked if there was anywhere nearby they could stay. After cashing in the check, they walked down the road to the hotel in town, or the motel in town. But Margaret knew what would happen inside this hotel room. This is where she was going to die. She almost yelled for help. She almost screamed in panic. But she decided to accept her fate. However, once the door was shut, Margaret was surprised to see that the only thing Ralph cared about was whether or not Joel's murder had made the news yet. After realizing that no one but themselves knew what really happened, they stopped at the restaurant next door to buy food and beer. Together, they watched an Elvis Presley movie as Ralph practiced Joel's signature so he could cash more checks. Ralph told Margaret that she could take anything out of Joel's bag as a memento, but Margaret decided not to. She did not want to touch any of Joel's things. The only thing she wanted, though, was to take a shower. Hoping for some alone time away from Ralph to be able to process all she's been through, she was mortified whenever he followed her into the bathroom. However, he never touched her. He never even looked at her. He just wanted to make sure that she wouldn't escape out the window in the bathroom. He turns away as she changes, gets into the shower, and he says, I could tell you were scared when we were hiking. You kept turning around like you thought I was about to shoot you. I almost gave you the gun just to calm you down. It's too bad, he says, that we didn't meet under different circumstances. If all of this hadn't happened, I could have really liked you. After showering, Margaret laid down and somehow fell asleep with Ralph sitting in a chair, with the gun sitting next to him. By mid-morning the next day, Margaret awoke to find Ralph in the same chair, seeming to have not moved at all throughout the night. They walked down the street to a gas station to cash one of Joel's checks for another $20. After receiving the money, Ralph told Margaret that he would still let her go, but he couldn't just let her go because if she tried to hitchhike, she could meet someone dangerous, and Ralph didn't want to put her life in danger. And so, pointing a gun at her, they travel to a bus station, and they agree that at the bus station they'll part ways, with Ralph getting on a bus and then Margaret getting on a bus after him. Like I said, with Ralph's bus scheduled for Atlanta, it was arriving late. He began to talk to Margaret. It was stupid to let you live. I know you'll go running to the police, and the cops will be looking for a man with a green backpack. I had counted on a few hours of head start. I promise you that if you call the police as soon as I leave, and they're waiting for me in Atlanta, innocent people are going to die. I'll start shooting, and I don't care who gets hurt. You should write a book about this. You could really make some money. And so Ralph's bus finally arrived, and Margaret watched as he boarded the bus and disappearing. While sitting waiting for her bus, Margaret's heart raced as she thought about seeing her mother again, but also dreading Ralph's return. But her bus arrived, and she got onto her bus, which was traveling towards Columbia. After departing from her bus in Columbia, Margaret called the police, telling them what had happened. Sheriff Frank Baker gathers together a search team, and they find Joel's body on May 11th. A week later, a tip from a Good Samaritan led police to Ralph's apartment, where a quick search revealed Joel's belongings and his backpack. After his arrest, Margaret picked Ralph out of a lineup, and over several hours she told the police what had happened. Ralph had admitted to stealing Joel's gear, tying Margaret up, and to the hike out to the motel, but he did not admit to the murder. Sheriff Baker had asked Ralph whether Joel was friendly or not, whether they had any confrontations. Ralph said that they didn't talk much. Ralph was sentenced to life in Georgia State Prison. And in 1991, Ralph was allowed to travel to Michigan on a furlough due to his brother's funeral. But eventually this turned into a full parole, with Ralph being allowed to move to Michigan and live in Michigan with his sister, just outside the city of Detroit. This was because of his fair treatment of Margaret during the entire ordeal, and his relatively good conduct while in prison. Even his family stated that he was different, that he was a changed man. On March 5th, 1992, the body of Diane Good was found outside Detroit. She was strangled to death. Ralph had fled the state shortly before the body was found, and he was arrested 2 days later. And after his arrest, he spent the remaining days of his life in prison, eventually passing away on June 2003. Oof. But yeah, so that's Margaret's story. But also too, I don't want to forget about Joel either. This is a photo of Joel. He was a photographer. He loved taking photos. There's not a lot of information about this case or Joel. Really, the only really surviving records of the photos that Joel took are from his yearbook. Because like I said, he was a member of the yearbook club, and he took a lot of photos. And so we don't have a lot of photos of Joel. But yeah, this is, like I said, this is a true story. And and yeah, I hope it was spooky enough. I said horror's not really my thing. But, and actually speaking, we'll bring back the horror music. Let's get a little, there we go. I'll turn it down a little bit, though. I said, yeah, I wanted to try to do a little Halloween episode. I wanted to try to do, like I said, kind of like what I was doing for the World War II episode, and the rhythm I've kind of found myself in for the Civil War episodes, as far as a bit of a template I can use in making future episodes, because like I said, I don't want to just do this one spin-off. I want to talk about and not just murders either. The murder is the first time I've kind of come across that as far as doing an episode on it. It's an area I never really touched on before, and so like I said, I want to try to set a bit of a precedent as far as how I do that, how I approach that topic. And so yeah, I think I'm just gonna put this out. We're gonna see how everything is, I guess. And then yeah, future. I'm working on Mussolini right now. So I decided for the World War II episodes, we're gonna do Mussolini. We're going to do the stock market crash, and then we're gonna pick things up again with Hitler, and we're gonna do Hitler's rise to power as far as actually becoming chancellor. Up through declaring war on the world, and then I think we'll go back and we'll take a look at Stalin. But yeah, that's the plan for the World War II episodes. Let's see, what's the other one? Hold on, I'm just trying to find the right horror music. I think this is a good one. I don't really like that. What about this one? Anyways, so yeah, and then Civil War, right? So like I said, that's the plan for World War II. First, we're gonna do an episode of Mussolini. Then we're gonna do the stock market crash. And then we're gonna go back to Hitler actually taking power, declaring war on everybody. Then we're gonna go back and look at Stalin. And then for the Civil War, I don't like this at all. God, this horror music sucks. The problem is I need copyright, free horror music, and so we'll just do this one over again. It was decent enough. But yeah, so and then going back and installing it for the Civil War, trying to do Vicksburg, do New Orleans, and then we'll do Grant versus Lee in the East, which will basically take us to Appomattox, and then that'll be it for the Civil War. Depending on how many episodes of that I do, we'll see. We might be done with the Civil War before the end of the year. We'll see though. Depends on how productive I remain to be. Yeah, anything else? No, I think that's it. That's all I got. Well, all right. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this spooky episode of the Danger Boys podcast series. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming next time. As always, hit the like button, comment, subscribe. I always appreciate it. And have yourself a wonderful day. And hey, namaste.